capable of standing as consciousness, we need to be able to look into the eye of the devil itself and simply face off in terms of light prevails darkness. Always does, always will. Whatever games are being played right now, righteousness prevails. Truth prevails. Beauty prevails. This is the way of life. This is the way of absolute. This is the way of Almighty. This is the way of being. And the question is entitled, Finding Courage in the Face of Suffering. Very, very appropriate. Very appropriate. Very fitting. How to find courage in the face of immense suffering, as Claude put it here. And there is much of it in the world right now. How do we stay connected to the heart, to love? How do we stay centered? How do we balance this within ourselves? It almost became, whenever I'm faced with this question, and although this question is very well put and very, very relevant to all times, certainly relevant to the time we live in right now, what we are all collectively faced with warmongering, let's say, expressions in the collective, pushing humanity to the verge of the catastrophic, potentially war, world war that is, conflict that is driven by insatiable greed and nothing else, insatiable greed for power, dominance, suppression, and of course for maintenance of the positions in society and wealth, extraordinary riches at that level. All these factors are now playing into themselves, into its final, hopefully, finale of resolution. And whether it has always been like that, or now we are in a position where this really tips the balance of the scales of light and darkness, it's for each and every one of us to answer, because it's a purely existential question. Some people have bypassed this a long time ago because they have already become the one way or another willing forces of cooperation with these dark forces, which is nothing other than unprocessed information which reaches catastrophic proportion. That's what, in a way, allegorically speaking, what darkness here represents, or that, not pregnant with religious connotations, what evil in the world represents is this unprecedented level of unprocessed, unconscious. That unconscious begins to dominate and blinds, usurps, perturbs, perverts, and displaces truth for lies fabricated in order to maintain its position. How do we remain open, connected to the heart and love in the face of such, let's say, unprecedented set of circumstances? Well, as a default, with questions like this, first and foremost, remaining authentic in all circumstances. We have to be authentic first to begin with. So what do I mean by that? Let's look into this closely. Let's look at it closer. First of all, that connectedness to the heart remaining undivided and in love, seeing everything from the place of light, love, and equanimity, does not mean somehow being oblivious or aloof, let alone indifferent to what is happening to those who, let's say, right now, subjected to unimaginable injustice and suffering and pain. And this is where misunderstanding often slips in disguise of spiritual, let's say, way of seeing things. All too often we see how people confuse still today a true state of equanimity for simply putting a consciously, in this case, they consider this to be done consciously, but in fact, it's the display and exercise of that same very unconscious force that makes us somehow believe that in order to come from the place of love and connected to the heart, we should not be perturbed and should not be distracted by the sufferings of others. And so therefore we create a cocoon of psychological comfort around ourselves where we can somehow preserve that state of equanimity at all costs so as not to get exposed to what otherwise deeply disturbing. But you see, this in itself is paradoxically untrue to the state of true connectedness to the heart, true state of being centered in love. So not of love-centric perspective is inseparable from being able to see everything how it is, for what it is, being able to hold this, even though it presents often irreconcilable paradox of how can it be that there is only one being, we are one, indivisible whole. All this is one indivisible reality. All this, what displays itself through infinite myriad of forms and phenomena, where some of its aspects find in deepest, most acute contradiction to the level of mortal conflict, to the level of trying to incinerate its opposite, whatever that opposite is being perceived as a threat, whatever is being perceived as an obstacle to the fulfillment of one's objective at the respective levels of its manifestation of that one single being. How can that be? Why wouldn't being display the qualities of harmony all around, that harmony of which we all speak as a potential, a reachable, mutually agreeable world to live, is something for which a lot of studies sooner or later would be dedicated in depth when we move to a more consciousness-based system of understanding of who we are. Because here the conflicting tendency already is justified by a lot of outlived thinking rooted in that materialistic perspective of which is in itself is very, very divisive, in itself is written in contradictions at the get-going, where, effectively speaking, the justification for the atrocities, injustice, and inflicting pain on other beings is done because it is considered to be part and parcel of the language of nature, you see? So this is how perplexed we have become in our minds. And this is what gives ideological platform for those groups, societal and otherwise, on the national, on the level of the nations, as in the case with, let's say, Israel took the right to exercise its rights over well-being and livelihood and lives eventually of other people, because they feel that they are superior in every way. They come from a place of supremacy. So that supremacy dictates the necessity to expand in the living space. It's absolutely the same ideology that drove Nazi Germany to its expansive military campaigns, resulting in the Second World War. We know that this, how the German race was indoctrinated, that it requires space, geographical and otherwise, because it's a chosen people, a chosen race, and for them, they have that responsibility before perhaps God, before the evolution of human beings. So therefore, the means justifying the end was already given. Once that happens, we embark on atrocity irrespective of how much blood will be spilled, how much injustice will be wielded around in the name of greater justice. You see, so this division comes from the place of systematic misinterpretation of the essence of who we are, to the level of buckling it up, intertwining it, weaving together religious sentiments which play a very, very strong role and place in terms of how can that be then brought into practice. Because that's a very strong sentiment. Religious sentiment perhaps is the strongest sentiment that there is. So if someone is given that supremacy at birth, then one would begin to exercise that supremacy, and nothing can prevent them, nothing can stop them, because they already feel God is on their side. It's a very dangerous, very, very rotten perspective. And this perspective is paradoxically, although masquerading itself as a religious sentiment, in fact is nothing other than outlived paradigm of the same centuries upon centuries of that what people have been indoctrinated with in terms of the what really here human being represents at a given. So human being here is not as someone placed as an agent of God, where some kind of affairs on behalf of the divine laws are maintained by a chosen race of people. Where is the unifying principle in that? It's divisive for a purpose, and the purpose is blunt and clear. The purpose is to continue that insatiable desire for greed, and more greed. Because the roots of, let's say, a country like Israel, obviously, are not just in the group of people coming from Europe who were driven by zealots, slogans of the Zionism to establish a holy land. No, this is just for a simpleton, given the perspective. The roots of that are much more sinister. The roots of that, of course, are displayed and outlined and clearly spoken of in terms of that is a part and parcel of colonial past. That's how colonialism functioned. That's how people of this or that country went into another part of the world and declared these people to be inferior, to be ruled over, to be indoctrinated, to be converted, to be missionarized, because that's what it is. Missionaries all over the world conducted their affairs on behalf of the empires by cahooting with the idea of the God Almighty and bringing so-called religious truth to this part of the world or that part of the world only to divide and conquer, only to divide and cause suffering, injustice. So how can we live in a world today, right now, and truly witness the unfoldment of our true potential, where that centeredness in the heart, connectedness to the heart, love-centric, nature-centric perspective must dominate everything, must be prior to everything, is to, first of all, wake up to all this, what has been either swept under the rag of historical inaccuracies and lies, or what is going to be simply spoken of as social engineering. All that indoctrination. This is where my work here clearly took a turn, that we cannot just withdraw into a spiritual cocoon and pretend that somehow individual freedom is independent from the collective state of affairs. It's an illusion. It's wishful thinking at best. Yes, with that being said, of course, there are phases, and I speak about these phases whenever it's due, when we do need to protect ourselves, just as that tender phase, the phase of unbudding, the phase of budding, the phase of when the seed begins to break out, still covered by that deep, rich, black soil, before it can reach to the light. In that state, of course, that state of germination, that state of incubation needs to be guarded. So yes, there is the state of ashram. There is a state of quarantine, spiritual quarantine, where you need to minimize the exposure, which otherwise would have the potential to destroy this tender, supple, yet perhaps not having enough spine to itself to stand for what it is. But once, for those of us who have witnessed this unfoldment, capable of standing as consciousness, we need to be able to look into the eye of the devil itself and simply face off in terms of light prevails darkness. Always does, always will. Whatever games are being played right now, righteousness prevails. Truth prevails. Beauty prevails. This is the way of life. This is the way of absolute. This is the way of Almighty. This is the way of being. Whatever is being played right now as this conflicting, deeply dividing tendencies at the extreme levels of its manifestation, at the levels of the extremities, let's say, of the manifestation, at its level of diversity. It ought to play itself out where light restores the harmony. So knowing that, we can stay connected to the heart at all levels. We become powerful and empowered by that, not disempowered. So we are at once diamantine, like a katana that can cut through any iron, any steel, whilst at the same time as gentle as the flap of the butterfly wings, as supple and as tender as the most refined silk. We are as soft internally as baby's flesh or and budding cotton bud. This one need to understand once and for all, and one will never be swayed or let alone dissuade.